All right, so for our third and final conversation in this little mini series, we have Aaron Lewis. Aaron, are you able to patch your video? And hey, man, how's it going? I think you're on
Hello.
mute. Hey, great to see you. So, Aaron, I'll let you introduce yourself a little more formally, but I'll just note that Aaron is like one of the smarter writers that I've read content from on kind of these topics of identity and speech and a bunch of these issues. Some of his writing is on Ribbon Farm, which I really love. And if you don't know Ribbon Farm, you should check out Ribbon Farm because it's sweet. But Aaron, you want to give a little bit more of your background, then we'll dive into the identity conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Hi, my name's Aaron. I'm in New Hampshire right now. I started out working as a product designer on the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016. I spent a few years working as a designer at Uber after that. And for the last year or so, I've been doing my own independent research and writing about sort of like the history of media and the feedback loops between the media technologies we create, what they do to our psychologies, and then how that gets externalized into culture, and so on and so forth, to infinity and beyond.
Excellent. So yeah, so we'll talk about identity. I mean, again, identity is my personal hobby horse in this whole situation. You know, when I was at Facebook, I spent many years working on it. In my mind, it is the ultimate challenge and solution of moving from from a physical to a digital world. Right? Is the idea that in the real world, you know, your speech is a currency. It carries weight. It has a cost to it, a physical cost to it. You know, lying or has a cost to it, and telling the truth has value to it. And the digital environment, you know, fundamentally the internet was not built with identity and associated audience built in at a fundamental level. And so we've ended up in a world where we've kind of jerry-rigged it on top. And a lot of the problems kind of stem from that fundamental dynamic. But I'm kind of curious, I mean, am I overly focused on identity as the real solution to a lot of these speech questions?
No, not at all. Well, first I wanted to say I feel like I have to acknowledge how weird this frame is and how sad it is that I can't see everybody who's out there. It's just like you're talking to Sam and there's all these 53 people behind the screen. So hello. um, but no, I think identity is the exact right thing to be focusing on. And I think sort of the message of the digital medium as a whole is really causing us to peel back lots of assumptions and layers of assumptions that we've made about identity over the years. So the fact that, for example, I can really easily create a suite of Twitter alter egos and like have many different presentations of myself online, um, sort of sort of gets me to start questioning like, okay, what really is identity? Where do these questions about where do these assumptions about identity come from, and how did we like inherit them? So a lot of the things that become really easy when it comes to like creating new identities in digital worlds call into question a lot of, I think, old assumptions that we carry with us. So when we talk about, for example, the phrase real identity or the phrase legal identity, we have to go all the way back to, the 1600s, like attempts to basically make people really legible to the state in order to collect taxation. And so
Yep.
then on top of that whole like legal infrastructure that was created in order to make like identity really legible across time so that people's money could be collected on behalf of the state, this whole other like social piece of identity sort of bloomed or flourished on top of that legal infrastructure. And what digital does, it comes in and says, all those assumptions that you made that were tied to physical space, that were tied to bodies, that were tied to like actually being on land and like moving through built environments. None of those hold anymore because in digital spaces you don't have a body. You just have whatever kind of ethereal self that you've created. So I think that's why so many of these questions come up, is because it really gets to the core questions that we can no longer just like ignore or put on the back burner.
So yeah, so I think I obviously agree, and there's a very interesting history, for instance, of you know, industrialization and kind of the opening up of the world to travel and how identity moved with that, right? You know, historically, if you only had a reputation in your local community, you had one of those, you couldn't move away. you know, so you basically, your reputation was incredibly important to your financial and like life success. You know, we moved into a world rapidly where that became far more fungible. You can argue a lot of financial capital dollars was, and you know, the stitching together of the economy, of the cash economy, was a result of needing transportability of reputation, right? You know, and the ability to buy things globally as opposed to be stuck, you know, locked into a village. We now have this digital turn where all of a sudden I can die as many times as I want. I can recycle identities. I can rebuild identities. People look at this in a lot of ways as good, right? But it does really change the economics of speech pretty dramatically, right? In ways that I think are quite challenging. How do you think about like where we should be going from, should we try to be making the digital world more like the physical world? Should we be forcing people to have stronger identity in the digital world? Or should we just embrace a new reality where multiple identities are possible and things like that?
Well, I think the digital world has kind of a grain or a bias, you know, and um, the default impulse of institutions that currently hold power is to try to flatten the grain of the new territory or of the new medium to make it look like the thing that they're really familiar with, because that's the environment that they know how to operate inside of. So the initial impulse is to be like, all right, we're just going to take this thing that's digital, and even though it's actually way different than what came before, we're going to try to sort of retrofit our models of how things work onto this new territory and just like cross our fingers and hope for the best. I think that's probably what, I mean, that's already what people are trying to do / have done. But ultimately you're kind of just like, you're pushing against the current in a sense, like of how, like what kinds of behaviors and psychologies that digital media affords. And I just think back to like a lot of these questions are not really new. If you go back to the creation of the press and how much people freaked out about the fact that basically anyone could publish anything, or it was way easier for anyone to publish anything. Lots of people had access to distribution mechanisms they didn't have before. Of course, there was like pseudonyms and pen names, and so like fake identities and pseudonymity has been a threat to power for as long as there's been like more democratized media technology. And I think that there's always an attempt to like shut that down or try to put a container on it, make it more legible, put a lid so it's like doesn't, you know, disrupt the system that's currently in place. But ultimately, like the if you pretend that you can kind of like rewrite or paint over the way the medium sort of flows, then I think you're kind of just kicking the can down the road.
Perhaps, but there's also a really interesting history in terms of how these things have happened before, of cycles of fake news, and then the retreat of people who care about and need to care about reality into private spaces, and then either the cleaning up of the public sphere, or in some cases, people just coming to terms with the fact that it was all fake and recycling. So, you know, there's a when the printing press was invented, it wasn't just that the elites were scared of it because it democratized publication.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the press was really scammy, right, in that era,
yeah.
right? And what happened was the elites retreated from it to paid newsletters and paid news services, and the whole system eventually cycled and washed itself out. The question in my mind is like, are we just going to do that? This goes back to my whole, like, will we just grow out of it phase, right? Where like, will the public sphere and a lot of conversation get super scammy for a while, and then will everyone kind of just realize that it's super scammy and stop trusting it, and we'll kind of recycle? Or do you think this time is different?
Well, I think that you know, we've been talking a lot about deepfakes here. I think that what we're actually waking up to is that the public conversation has already been super scammy for like the last century or so, since the proliferation of televisual media. And I think deepfakes, like what's funny to me about the whole deepfake conversation is like it kind of holds up to a mirror to the media environment that existed before, and allows us to see it really clearly for the first time. You know, we talk about like, oh my gosh, these videos are edited, or like we can't tell what's real anymore. But I think a really expensive film is just a really expensive deepfake. Like, and there's always been a frame when it comes to how, if you think about someone like Cronkite, or the way that you know, news media with the 3 channels exists in the 20th century, there's always been a frame. There's always been some edited version of reality that's presented to the public. And the fact that now anyone can do that via the democratized tool of deepfake means that they're starting to realize the mechanisms by which reality was mediated through these different frames for the last 100 years. So I think,
but I want to push you on this because like there is a really big difference, which is it's not like one person's making one film and sharing it with everyone. The problem with deepfakes is I'm making infinity films for infinity different people, right?
right.
To match exactly what they want, and no one has any idea what other people are saying or what's real, right? So that is different. That is substantively different in my mind.
No, I totally agree that it's different. I guess what I'm saying is it's like it's a difference in degree and scale rather than kind.
Well,
So
I guess it's also a difference in, if we want to be really cynical about it, collective delusion versus individual delusion.
uh, the old media environment allowed an individual, like a single individual delusion, to get broadcast to masses. And
Right.
now the way you're framing it is basically everyone could create their own delusion and broadcast it to everyone else. But I would push back on that a little because I think fundamentally the assumption there is like a fundamental distrust in people and their ability to like make sense of their worlds and broadcast it to others. And I guess I just have I think the lowercase d Democrat in me just has a fundamental like belief in more participation, and I think like yes, whenever anyone can like share their reality to everybody else, of course there's an opportunity for quote unquote delusion, but there's also an opportunity for a lot of really positive story sharing and experience sharing and learning about other people.
I couldn't agree more. I just think harkening back to some of the earlier conversations in this kind of session we've been doing about democracy and coordination of large groups of people, there's an argument, potentially a very cynical argument, but that a collective shared delusion is in some ways, even if wrong, easier to manage in a democracy than like a fractured world.
Well, I would say that that's an oxymoron. Like manage collective shared delusion and democracy. Like then you're not really talking about democracy. Then you're talking about basically
that is accurate. that is 100. Yes, I will agree with you that is not the ideal of democracy. It's
not really democracy at all. It's just imposing like one person's or one group's view onto the masses.
I 100% think you're accurate. That is correct. Interesting. So when we get down to a practical level, like where we are with talk a little bit about your view of where we are today with digital identity and where we really should be going at a national level as well as kind of an individual level. Like what should we be building or how should the world look different in the next few years?
Yeah, I think what's really wild about digital identity is, and I've just been thinking a lot about digital identity and mass movements, and how the mass movements of today kind of relate to the ones that happened, around the civil rights era in the 60s. I think what's so interesting about digital identity today is that the consciousness of somebody like watching television news in the mid 20th century, it's almost timeless in a way because you're sort of stuck in this everlasting illusion of now. Like the thing that comes on TV tonight, this like 24-hour news cycle. What's really powerful about digital media is it puts like Library of Alexandria basically in everybody's pocket. And what that means is that regular, everyday, normal people can actually learn about history, look back on history, look at past movements in like really high fidelity, and they actually like it actually like lengthens their sense of self across time because they can like ingest so much more of what's happened in the past. Now that ability used to be like reserved basically for the elites. If you think about just the way the information environment works, like the people who were organizing these mass movements or the people who were kind of in charge of coordinating people, they had access to the most information, and that information asymmetry is what creates the ability to like organize large groups of people. So part of what like digital media has done to private identity is like collapse that information asymmetry and extend extend your personal sense of like how much history and past that you contain. And I think what's also really interesting, just like noticing the shift from a TV dominated media environment to the internet media environment, is McLuhan has this really awesome quote, which I like, which he says, um, the content of every new medium is the previous medium. And so I think in a lot of ways, the content of digital media is the way television works. So we kind of like, we had this system where there was like a Walter Cronkite type anchor, and he was like telling reality to everyone. And what we did with digital media, digital identity, is kind of shrink that into everyone's pockets. So now everyone is like their own anchor, broadcasting their view to the world. And there's this meme on TikTok, which is it's called main character energy, and you basically say it when you feel like you're the, you know, the star of your movie, or the anchor of your news show, so to speak. So I think the combination of like having a really deep sense of history, because you can access all information really easily, plus feeling like you're the anchor, or the main character, you have main character energy of your own reality, creates a really interesting combination that totally changes the shape of like how these protest movements work, because it's not just decentralized, because there's no really center, there's no circles, like they all moving in weird unfamiliar ways that that haven't been possible before.
Well, let me ask you a question again to risk angering people and going to very topical topics around identity, because you bring it up with the protest. It's like I see that tension for sure in my read of the situation, right? Is that this kind of like central character energy and this idea of like everyone having their own identity, and these movements has made a lot of things very decentralized that would have historically been very centralized, right? In terms of these movements and protests and how they go. My concern is that, to your point about interfacing with our physical economy and our physical government and things like that, that there's such a mismatch, right, in terms of like what you need to get things done in the real physical world versus how the internet culture and decentralized system has evolved, that there's a real problem when the two have to intersect, right? And that potentially, for instance, like the protests that we're seeing, you know, versus a top-down, differently organized structure might actually be less effective in the when interfacing with the physical realm. This is where I'm gonna get in trouble, versus what we're seeing today with internet culture. Do you think I'm wrong about that, or like how do you think about these new internet identities and internet cultures and kind of internet flows of power and identity intersecting with like historical, or the historical physical world, or the, I would say,
Yeah, I
historical
mean,
physical world?
I think ultimately it's sort of a problem of feedback loops, in the sense that like in a really healthy democracy, there has to be a tight feedback loop between systems of power and the people that are being represented, right? So I think part of what you're pointing to is the fact that that feedback loop is in some ways cut off. Like it seems like certain actions that you're trying to like motivate in the streets or in protests don't actually then like feedback into the laws or policy changes that are being proposed or like set in motion. And I think part of this is like a language problem, which is we've now distributed all these really wild new media technologies to like every single person in the country, and we have a system of power, like the people who are basically in government, who are still kind of running in the sort of 20th century mode, and they don't actually know how to communicate with each other yet, is the way I see it. And there's like there's kind of a mismatch, or like a floating past each other type of thing, because I mean, it almost goes back to a little bit what you're saying before. Like if people in power still have this assumption or this way of looking at the world that it's like, actually, we just need to manage large groups of people by creating shared delusions. If they're still trying to play like that game, then it's not gonna like interface well with the new game, which the cat's already out of the bag. Like people are just going to be sharing their realities with each other.
It is,
So
but the question, I guess the question is like, is there, so I mean, to take a really meta perspective, like,
uh,
is there a new way of managing successfully large populations with internet culture and internet identity? And the reason I say that is like, you know, I've been even today looking at like I read a book recently on the 1918 pandemic,
Uh-huh.
and versus today, right, and coronavirus. There are interesting places where they're very similar. The government similarly was super late to the punch and tried to quash down reality, and I mean, there are things like that. But ultimately, on the ground, the civic response was a lot more coordinated, and in some ways seems a lot more successful than what we're seeing happen today, right? And so my question almost is like, there's a physics to reality, and like we've baked out certain systems around that. I agree that the physics of the internet are different. Do you believe that the physics of reality are going to bend or evolve to match the internet, or do you think there's just a deep tension between two alternative worlds that are overlaid on top of each other?
Well, I think what you're describing is like, so in one sense, the to oversimplify, but the quote unquote algorithm almost acts as this like invisible hand coordination mechanism, that maybe is almost like a successor to the old ways of doing mass coordination, just like influencing what people see and like funneling people into different, um, I guess, echo chambers of sorts. So there's like one way I guess this could go is almost post-human, which is where the thing that is coordinating all these people, like nodes in the network, is something that people feel like they don't really have control over, which is the sorting mechanisms and algorithms that mediate people's reality. But I think fundamentally, like the 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 other approach, which is not post-human, is like returning to, or basically reanimating like um, local ways of doing politics. And like so much of our attention has been directed by the media towards like national national big media that we have no control over. And so I think that the way that's not post-human is like returning to some sense of embodiment in your community, like sharing stories with the people who are around you. And like the original impulse of democracy, right, is like, okay, if we all are like doing this in a really participatory way and we're involved with the people we live around, then the idea is that those solutions and things kind of bubble up.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons I always love talking to you and hearing your viewpoints. Is like, to me, the answer, and maybe it's because I'm old or just narrow in my thinking, is like, look, we need to like push the internet to be more like the physical world with like structured identity and reputation, and we can map the internet to the physical world and create cost for speech, and then open it up and make it free. And like, there's like a way to move the internet to fit into the existing model. To your point about like wanting to move in that direction, I always find it challenging when we talk about moving away from the current system because of the realities of like not living in an abundant society and like having resource allocation problems and like increasing problems with like local communities are great when they're kind of self reinforcing, but they really have challenges when you can enter and leave them freely and they scale in weird ways. But I do always love your perspective, which is like, well, maybe the physical world needs to change to be more like the internet.
Well, it's about finding the right like hybrid and the way that they can like dance with one another, right? Because they're going to continue to co-evolve.
So let me ask you, kind of to bring it back to the conversations we were having earlier. I'm kind of curious, when you hear these discussions we just had about deepfakes, but then especially about regulation and regulation at a national level versus a platform level. I mean, what are your takes? Like, should we be moving towards a world of like no regulation of speech, right? And like let people, on the internet have as many identities and fracture any way which they want? Like, where do you come out on regulations? Where do you come out on the risks versus, future deepfakes, et cetera, from your perspective?
I guess I don't know that I have any like hot takes on regulation, except that I guess I'm just trying to really like pay attention and see how it is that um, internet identity works, how it affects our psychologies, and how these new media technologies basically reorient and reshift the media landscape. And I'm trying to be, I think, just a realist about how um, like if you even if you try to regulate and you try to clamp down, or you try to like change the shape of the internet and the way it works and flows, I think maybe that would have been possible to do like in the early 90s. But again, I think that eventually, it's just like the thing's going to continue to, it's sort of alive. It's sort of an organism, like it's going to continue to evolve, and like any way of acting on it that is based in sort of an older way of understanding how it works is going to just meet resistance.
Fair enough. So thinking, I'll do this question we use. Thinking forward 10 years in the evolution of the things you're seeing today, whether it's, TikTok, multiple identities, how groups form, these fascinating cults that are evolving. What, like,
see the step chickens.
Step chickens is incredible. If anyone on the line has not spent time looking at Step Chickens, you should. It's important because it's crossed the chasm, and even the New York Times wrote an article about it.
That's
but what
for you. Yeah.
Like what's coming next? Like where are we going to be? When you start layering in again better deepfakes, VR, blah blah blah. Like I don't know. What conversation are we having in 10 years about identity?
Well, I think it comes back to what I was saying about the way that our like physical environments are going to co-evolve with the digital landscape and our digital sense of self. And part of this is like really deep recognition of the fact that we're also in the middle of an ecological crisis. And I feel like there's going to be an interesting, like, because there's so many interesting experiments going on around like earth regeneration and like decentralized ways of doing like ecological work. I think that we'll see an interesting like marriage of people who are like thinking, really abstractly about digital identity and digital worlds, but then also a sort of regrounding of digital identity or identity in general back into place, and trying to figure out, because when we're on the phone or on the air, we sort of have no bodies, and this tech is it's almost like ethereal, like ghostly, spiritual. Like none of us are in the same room. We're all just kind of like floating in the ethers. And I think there will be a longing for some kind of like regrounding, and figuring out how to like reintegrate. Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, no question that the lack of airlines is going to relocalize communities in interesting ways. Cool, Aaron. Well, listen, I really appreciate you taking the time. Again, I really appreciate your thinking and perspective on a lot of this stuff. I think you're one of the smartest people about this.